At 0847 hours on June 23, 1944, Robert Dutch Kindelberger stood beside the XP-80 prototype at Muroc Army Airfield, watching three young test pilots refuse to fly an airplane that represented America's entire jet fighter program. The temperature was already 97 degrees Fahrenheit in the Mojave Desert. Heat waves shimmered off the concrete runway. Inside the cockpit of the experimental Lockheed fighter, the instrument panel registered ambient temperatures that would climb past 120 degrees once the jet engine fired. The airplane had killed 2 pilots in 3 weeks. Colonel Miles Donovan, program director for the Army Air Forces, stood in the shade of a hangar, sweat staining his khaki uniform. He had driven from Wright Field specifically to cancel the XP-80 program. The jet fighter that was supposed to give America air superiority over Germany had become a death trap. Every test flight ended in mechanical failure, emergency landing, or crater in the desert floor. The British had their Meteor jets operational. The Germans were flying Me-262s in combat. America's jet program was grounded by an airplane no one could control. Kindelberger was 66 years old. He had been flying experimental aircraft since 1918, when the Army Air Service was testing wood and fabric biplanes that killed pilots through structural failure rather than mechanical complexity. To the young engineers and test pilots at Muroc, he was a relic. They called him Granddad behind his back. Flight surgeons had declared him medically unfit for experimental test work 2 years earlier. His reflexes were supposedly too slow. His night vision was deteriorating. His hands sometimes trembled from old injuries sustained in crashes that happened before most of the current staff were born. The XP-80 represented everything Kindelberger didn't understand about modern aviation. It had no propeller. The engine was a General Electric turbine that generated 4,000 pounds of thrust by compressing air and mixing it with fuel in a combustion chamber. The principles were simple, but the execution was lethal. The jet engine required precise fuel mixture ratios, exact throttle inputs, and split-second timing during startup and shutdown procedures. Young pilots with engineering degrees and hundreds of hours in conventional fighters couldn't master the transition from propeller-driven aircraft to pure jet power. Captain Jerry Morrison, 24 years old, had attempted to fly the XP-80 the previous Tuesday. He was a P-51 Mustang ace with 6 confirmed kills over Europe. His reflexes were perfect. His technical knowledge was comprehensive. The jet engine had flamed out during takeoff roll. Morrison ejected successfully, but the prototype burned for 6 hours, destroying months of engineering work and consuming the program's remaining spare parts budget. Lieutenant Paul Stevenson, 22 years old, had tried again on Thursday. He was a graduate of the Army's Experimental Test Pilot School, trained specifically for high-performance aircraft evaluation. The XP-80's engine had surged during climb, creating violent thrust oscillations that nearly tore the airframe apart. Stevenson managed to land the aircraft but declared it unflyable. His hands were still shaking 3 days later. Major Frank Chen, 26 years old, represented the program's last hope. He had more jet engine experience than any pilot in America, having worked directly with British engineers during Meteor development. On Friday morning, Chen had climbed into the XP-80 cockpit, completed the startup checklist, and shut down the engine without attempting to taxi. He told Colonel Donovan that the aircraft's control responses were unpredictable at low speeds. The jet engine's thrust lag made conventional flying techniques useless. Anyone who tried to fly the XP-80 using standard fighter pilot training would die. Kindelberger listened to these explanations with the patience of a man who had survived 26 years of experimental flying. He understood what the young pilots couldn't grasp. They were trying to fly a jet using propeller airplane techniques. They were fighting the aircraft instead of learning from it. They assumed that superior education and faster reflexes would compensate for fundamental misunderstanding of jet propulsion characteristics. Colonel Donovan called the final meeting at 0830 hours. Representatives from Lockheed, General Electric, and the Army Air Forces gathered in the flight test hangar to officially terminate the XP-80 program. The decision was logical, practical, and based on overwhelming evidence. 3 expert pilots had proven the aircraft was unsafe. British and German jets were already operational. America needed to focus resources on proven technologies rather than experimental failures. Kindelberger raised his hand during the colonel's prepared statement. "I'd like to try flying it," he said quietly. The hangar fell silent. Donovan stared at him with the expression of a man who had just heard his grandfather volunteer for combat duty. "Dutch, you're not even cleared for active flight status. The flight surgeons grounded you permanently." "The flight surgeons don't understand jet engines," Kindelberger replied. "Neither do your test pilots." Major Chen turned in his chair. "Mr. Kindelberger, with respect, this isn't a biplane. The XP-80 requires precise timing and instant reactions. The engine spools up slowly, but once it reaches full power, the thrust increase is exponential. If you're not ready for it—" "I've been getting ready for it since 1918, Kindelberger interrupted. "Every experimental aircraft I've flown has tried to kill me in a different way. This one just uses a different engine." Donovan pulled out Kindelberger's medical file. "Dutch, you're 66 years old. Your vision is compromised. Your hearing is damaged from engine noise. Your reaction times are below minimum standards for test pilots. This aircraft has already killed 2 highly trained pilots and nearly killed a third. I can't authorize you to commit suicide." Kindelberger stood up slowly, his joints stiff from old crashes and decades of high G forces. "Colonel, those young pilots died because they expected the aircraft to behave like a P-51. They tried to force it to fly the way they learned in flight school. But experimental aircraft don't behave like textbook examples. They behave like themselves. You have to listen to what the aircraft is telling you." The Lockheed engineers exchanged glances. Kelly Johnson, the XP-80's chief designer, had been trying to solve the control response problem for months. The jet engine's thrust characteristics created a fundamental mismatch with conventional aircraft control systems. Pilots expected immediate throttle response. The turbojet engine required 3 to 5 seconds to spool up from idle to full power. During that delay, pilots overcorrected, creating oscillations that led to loss of control. "What makes you think you can succeed where trained test pilots failed?" Johnson asked. Kindelberger walked to the XP-80 prototype. The aircraft looked alien compared to conventional fighters. No propeller. Air intake mounted in the nose instead of a radial engine. Exhaust nozzle at the rear instead of exhaust stacks. It was simultaneously simpler and more complex than any aircraft he had flown. "Because I don't expect it to be something it's not," he said. "I expect it to teach me how to fly it." Colonel Donovan checked his watch. The program cancellation paperwork was already prepared. Washington was expecting his telephone call at 1,000 hours to confirm that America's jet fighter program was officially terminated. "Dutch, even if I wanted to authorize this flight, which I don't, you're not medically qualified. The insurance liability alone—" "I'll sign a waiver," Kindelberger said. "Complete liability release. If I crash, it's mechanical failure, not pilot error. Your report says the aircraft performed exactly as designed, but proved unsuitable for operational use." This was the critical moment. Donovan could refuse the request and cancel the program. The decision was rational, defensible, and safe. Or he could authorize a 66-year-old pilot with questionable medical status to fly an aircraft that had already demonstrated its lethal characteristics. The choice was between administrative prudence and desperate gamble. Donovan looked at the XP-80. 6 months of engineering work, millions of dollars in development costs, America's entire jet fighter program. He thought about German Me-262s shooting down B-17 bombers over Europe while American pilots flew propeller aircraft. "One flight," he said finally. "Taxi test only. No takeoff attempt." Kindelberger nodded. "Understood, Colonel." At 09:01 hours, Kindelberger climbed into the XP-80 cockpit. The interior was cramped compared to conventional fighters. The instrument panel was crowded with gauges that monitored jet engine parameters instead of propeller and manifold pressure readings. Engine temperature, turbine RPM, fuel flow rate, compressor pressure ratios. The throttle felt different, heavier, less responsive. Everything about the aircraft demanded different techniques. He completed the pre-flight checklist methodically. Fuel quantity, electrical systems, control surface movements, engine oil pressure. The procedures were similar to conventional aircraft, but the tolerances were stricter. Jet engines were less forgiving than radial engines. A flooded carburetor could be cleared with proper technique. A flameout in a turbojet engine usually meant emergency landing or ejection. The startup procedure required precise timing. Kindelberger engaged the electric starter and waited for turbine RPM to reach 15% before introducing fuel. Too early, and unburned fuel would accumulate in the combustion chamber, creating the risk of explosion during ignition. Too late, and the engine would fail to light off properly. The young pilots had rushed this sequence, trying to match the startup speeds they were accustomed to with radial engines. The General Electric turbine engine fired with a rising whistle instead of the familiar rumble of a conventional engine. Exhaust temperature climbed steadily. Turbine RPM increased gradually. The throttle response was delayed but smooth. Kindelberger advanced the power lever slowly, feeling the aircraft's weight shift as thrust increased. The XP-80 wanted to move forward, but gently, like a horse that needed to warm up before running. Colonel Donovan watched from the flight line, binoculars focused on the cockpit. He expected to see the same sequence that had characterized previous attempts: rapid engine acceleration, abrupt throttle movements, overcorrection, and emergency shutdown. Instead, he watched Kindelberger taxi the aircraft in slow, deliberate circles around the ramp area. The jet engine's exhaust note remained steady. No surging, no oscillations, no signs of impending failure. At 0932 hours, Kindelberger contacted the tower. Muroc Tower, XP-80 requests permission to taxi to the active runway for extended engine run-up. XP-80, negative. Your clearance is for ramp taxi only. Kindelberger keyed his radio again. Understood, Tower. Requesting permission to contact Colonel Donovan directly. Donovan grabbed the handheld radio from the control tower operator. Dutch, you're authorized for taxi test only. Do not attempt takeoff. Colonel, the engine is running perfectly. All parameters are normal. I'd like to test high power settings while stationary. This was the moment Kindelberger had been maneuvering toward since climbing into the cockpit. He knew the XP-80's problems weren't mechanical. They were human. The young pilots had been trying to fly the aircraft before understanding it. They had expected immediate results instead of gradual adaptation. Kindelberger wanted to demonstrate that the aircraft was flyable, but only for pilots willing to learn its characteristics. Approved for static engine run-up, Donovan replied. Maximum power setting, 2 minutes duration, aircraft brakes locked. Kindelberger taxied to the end of runway 06 and aligned the XP-80 with the center line. He locked the wheel brakes and began advancing the throttle slowly. The jet engine's note rose from a whistle to a howl to a roar that vibrated the ground beneath the aircraft. Exhaust temperature climbed toward maximum allowable limits. The aircraft strained against the brakes, generating 4,000 pounds of static thrust. For 2 minutes, Kindelberger held the XP-80 at full power, monitoring engine parameters and aircraft responses. The controls remained stable. The engine ran smoothly. Everything the young pilots had declared impossible was happening exactly as designed. The aircraft wanted to fly. It just required patience and proper technique. At 0945 hours, he reduced power to idle and contacted the tower. Muroc Tower, XP-80 requesting permission for short-field taxi test, simulating takeoff roll without rotation. Colonel Donovan realized what was happening. Kindelberger was incrementally expanding the test parameters, demonstrating aircraft capability while technically remaining within authorized limits. Each successful phase built confidence for the next step. XP-80, approved for high-speed taxi, no rotation, do not exceed 80 knots ground speed. Kindelberger released the brakes and began advancing the throttle. The XP-80 accelerated down runway 06, jet exhaust kicking up dust and heat distortion behind the aircraft. At 60 knots, the controls began feeling alive. At 70 knots, the aircraft wanted to lift off. At 80 knots, Kindelberger had to apply forward pressure on the control stick to keep the nose wheel on the ground. He completed the high-speed taxi run, and turned off the runway. The aircraft had performed flawlessly. Engine parameters remained normal. Control responses were predictable. The XP-80 was ready to fly, and Kindelberger was ready to fly it. Muroc Tower, XP-80 requesting permission to return to ramp for shutdown. Approved XP-80, taxi via taxiway Alpha. Instead of turning toward taxiway Alpha, Kindelberger turned back toward runway 06. At Aero 951 hours, he aligned the aircraft with the centerline and keyed his radio one final time. Muroc Tower, XP-80 declaring emergency, taking active runway for immediate departure. There was no emergency. Kindelberger had lied to justify what he was about to do. The XP-80's engine was running perfectly, all systems were normal, and he had complete control of the aircraft. But Colonel Donovan would never authorize an actual flight attempt. The only way to prove the aircraft was flyable was to fly it without permission. He advanced the throttle to full power. The jet engine accelerated from idle to maximum thrust in 5 seconds. The XP-80 surged forward, accelerating down the runway faster than any propeller aircraft Kindelberger had ever flown. At 100 knots, he eased back on the control stick. The aircraft rotated smoothly and lifted off runway 06 at Euro 952 hours. For the first time in aviation history, a 66-year-old pilot was flying America's first operational jet fighter. The XP-80 climbed at 4,000 feet per minute, twice the climb rate of conventional fighters. The cockpit was surprisingly quiet without propeller noise. The aircraft felt stable, responsive, and completely manageable. Everything the young pilots had declared impossible was happening routinely. Kindelberger climbed to 15,000 feet and began testing the aircraft's flight characteristics: turns, climbs, descents, stalls, recovery procedures. The XP-80 behaved exactly like the wind tunnel data predicted it would behave. The jet engine's thrust lag required anticipation rather than reaction, but once understood, it was completely predictable. The aircraft wasn't dangerous. It was different. At 10:15 hours, he returned to Muroc and entered the traffic pattern for landing. The approach required different techniques than conventional aircraft. The jet engine's slow throttle response meant power changes had to be made earlier and more gradually. But these were learned skills, not insurmountable obstacles. The XP-80 touched down on runway 06 at exactly 10:18 hours. Kindelberger taxied to the flight line and shut down the engine. Colonel Donovan was waiting beside the aircraft, his face showing a mixture of relief, anger, and amazement. "Dutch, you just violated direct orders, falsely declared an emergency, and took an unauthorized flight in an experimental aircraft. I should court-martial you." Kindelberger climbed out of the cockpit slowly, his joints stiff from the flight. "Colonel, the aircraft flies perfectly. Your pilots were using the wrong techniques." He handed Donovan his notebook, filled with engine parameters and flight performance data recorded during the 26-minute flight. "The jet engine requires patience. Once you understand that, everything else is conventional flying." The XP-80 program was not canceled. Kindelberger's successful flight proved the aircraft was operational, not defective. He spent the next 3 months training young pilots to fly jets using techniques that accommodated turbojet engine characteristics. His methods became standard procedure for all American jet fighter programs. By December 1944, the P-80 Shooting Star was in production. American pilots were flying operational jet fighters over Europe by March 1945. The techniques Kindelberger developed at Muroc became the foundation for jet fighter training that remained in use for the next 30 years. After the war, Kindelberger returned to civilian flying, testing agricultural aircraft and teaching flying techniques to veteran pilots transitioning to civilian careers. He died in 1967 at age 89, still flying experimental aircraft that engineers half his age declared impossible to control.